At dawn in Millie's diner, veteran Harry Whitaker sips coffee until a biker's shadow falls across his corner booth. The biker circles like a predator, boots echoing, while Harry stays calm, steady hands on his coffee, eyes locked in quiet resolve. Outside, Humvees arrive in tight formation. Inside, Captain Whitaker steps in, the biker's confidence fading fast. On Main Street, the biker is cuffed beside military Humvees, as Harry and his son stand tall, the town watching in silence. Weeks later, at the veterans' table, Harry shakes a young boy's hand. The plaque behind him honoring all who served. Welcome to Mixie Veteran Stories, where we honor the courage, sacrifice, and unbreakable bonds of those who served. If you believe every veteran's story deserves to be heard, make sure to like, subscribe, and share so their legacy lives on. Sergeant First Class Harold Harry Whitaker had lived in Millbrook for over 4 decades, long enough to know the rhythm of its mornings by heart. At 79, his life was measured in steady, deliberate routines: morning coffee at Millie's diner, a quiet conversation with the regulars, a slow walk back home past the War Memorial on Main Street. His body bore the wear of time's stiff joints, deep creases etched into his face, but his posture remained straight, the bearing of a man who had once commanded respect on battlefields far from home. Harry's military career had been long and hard-fought. 2 tours in Vietnam and 1 in Desert Storm. The scars on his hands told their own story: burns from field repairs under enemy fire, shrapnel wounds from a mortar blast in 2069. The medals he'd earned were stored away in a small wooden box, rarely spoken of. But his neighbors knew who he was and what he'd given for the country. In Millbrook, people didn't have to ask Harry to tell war stories. His quiet dignity was enough. That Tuesday morning started like any other. At 5:45 a.m., Harry pulled on his well-worn army cap, the brim frayed from years of wear, and made his way to Millie's. The air was crisp, the streets nearly empty except for the newspaper boy making his rounds. Inside the diner, the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon wrapped around him like an old blanket. He took his usual booth in the back corner, a spot that gave him a good view of the street while allowing for some privacy. Millie herself, a friend since high school, poured him a steaming cup without asking. By 6:15, the regulars had settled into their spots. Conversations drifted between the weather, the local high school's upcoming football game, and the mayor's new parking proposal. The atmosphere was as warm and predictable as the checkered floors and faded photographs on the walls. Among the pictures was a small section honoring the town's veterans, black and white portraits of young men in uniform. Harry's among them, taken when he was just 19 and the world still seemed simple. But at 6:32 a.m., the morning's peace fractured. The bell above the diner door jingled sharply, and in walked a man whose presence immediately shifted the air. He was massive, broad-shouldered, and leather-clad, with a scowl that seemed carved into his face. The man's boots thudded heavily against the floor, and his eyes swept the diner like a predator sizing up its territory. Conversations faltered. Even the sound of the coffee machine seemed quieter. Harry noticed him immediately, but his reaction was measured. Combat had taught him to assess threats calmly, without telegraphing alarm. The man's gait was aggressive, his jaw tight, the kind of posture Harry recognized from those who thrived on intimidation. As the stranger scanned the room, his gaze locked on Harry's corner booth. "Hey, old man," the biker called, his voice carrying over the hum of the diner. "I want that booth." Harry looked up slowly from his folded newspaper. His hazel eyes, still sharp despite his age, met the man's without flinching. "Plenty of empty booths, son," he said evenly, his tone low but firm. "No need for trouble." The biker chuckled, a harsh, mocking sound. "Trouble? You don't know what trouble is." He took a step closer, towering over the table. "I said I want that booth." Harry had seen this before: the test of wills, the bait for confrontation. In the jungle, such moments could mean life or death. Here, It was just a diner in a small American town. Still, the principle was the same. De-escalation first. "I've been sitting here for over 20 years, Harry replied, setting his coffee down. "But if you really need it, I suppose I could." The slap came before the sentence could finish. A vicious, open-handed strike knocked Harry's cap to the floor and sent his coffee spilling across the table. The sound cracked through the diner like a rifle shot. For a heartbeat. The room froze. Millie stood behind the counter, her hand trembling over the coffee pot. A couple in the booth nearest the door stared in shock. Harry's cheek stung, the warmth of spilled coffee seeping into his sleeve. But his expression didn't change. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down, picked up his cap, brushed it off, and set it back on his head. The biker loomed over him, smirking as if he'd won some unspoken contest. But Harry Whitaker was far from beaten. "Miss," he said to Millie, his voice calm. She nodded quickly, pointing to the payphone near the restrooms. Harry stood, moving with deliberate slowness, ignoring the biker's jeers about old men and knowing your place. Lifting the receiver, Harry dialed from memory a number he'd only ever used once before. "Daniel," he said when the line connected, his tone clipped and precise. "It's Dad. I'm at Millie's on Main Street. I've been assaulted by a civilian. Could use some backup." Captain Daniel Whitaker, stationed at Fort Campbell, understood instantly. His father wasn't one to exaggerate, and his choice of words carried a coded urgency. "On my way," Daniel replied. Harry hung up, walked back to his booth, and sat down. Outside, the street was still quiet, but in his mind, he could already hear the low rumble of diesel engines on the approach. Back in his booth, Sergeant First Class Harry Whitaker settled into the same steady posture he had carried in war zones, calm, collected, but watchful. The swelling on his cheek was beginning to show, a faint red bloom that stood out against his weathered skin. The biker, mistaking Harry's stillness for surrender, smirked as he planted himself in the booth directly across the aisle. "See, wasn't so hard," the man said, draping one arm across the back of the seat like he was claiming a throne. "Sometimes, you just need to learn your place." Around them, the atmosphere had shifted. The regulars, who usually lingered over their second cup of coffee, were suddenly asking for their checks. The quiet hum of conversation was replaced by an uneasy silence broken only by the occasional clink of cutlery. Millie stood behind the counter, her face pale but her eyes fixed on Harry, silently asking if she should call the police. Harry gave a slight shake of his head. He had already called for help. Help that would arrive in a way this man could never anticipate. He lifted his cup, now refilled by Millie without a word, and took a slow sip. His gaze drifted to the window, scanning the street with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for the right moment. The biker didn't like being ignored. He leaned forward, his voice louder now, meant for everyone in the diner to hear. "You know, I've dealt with guys like you before. Think you're better than everyone just because you wore a uniform 40 years ago. Well, newsflash, this is my booth now." Harry kept his tone even. "Son, you've mistaken my patience for weakness. That's a bad read in my line of work." The biker laughed, though it was a touch forced. "Your line of work? You're retired. Sitting here drinking coffee like every other old fossil in town." He scanned the room, as if looking for allies among the customers. None met his eyes. A young waitress named Sophie, new to the job, stepped hesitantly toward them. "Sir," she said to the biker, "maybe you could just take another seat. Mr. Whitaker's been coming here for—" "Don't care if he's been coming here for 100 years, the biker snapped, making Sophie flinch. "He disrespected me, so I set him straight." That last sentence hung heavy in the air. Harry noted the shift in the room, people pulling back, not wanting to get involved, the way civilians sometimes did when trouble felt too close. It was the same expression he'd seen in small villages overseas when a fight was brewing and no one wanted to be caught in the crossfire. The biker, emboldened by the lack of intervention, began pacing between tables. His heavy boots thudded against the black and white checkered floor, each step designed to draw attention. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he announced. "Respect your betters, and nobody gets hurt." Harry's eyes flicked to the clock above the counter. 6 minutes had passed since the call. He knew the distance to Fort Campbell, knew the speed a military convoy could make when the order was given. The math in his head was exact. They'd be here soon. The biker turned his attention back to Harry, leaning in close enough that the smell of stale cigarettes and leather was overwhelming. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Thought soldiers were supposed to fight." Harry's reply was quiet but carried across the room. "Real soldiers know when not to fight." That answer seemed to infuriate the man more than anything. He slammed his hand down on the table hard enough to rattle the coffee cups. "You think you're smarter than me, old man?" Harry didn't blink. "I think I've lived long enough to know this isn't going to end the way you think it will." The biker straightened, confused by the confidence in Harry's voice. But before he could respond, the faint rumble of engines began to creep into the edges of the diner's soundscape. It was subtle at first, just a low vibration underfoot. Most people didn't notice. Harry did. He took another sip of coffee. "Time's about up," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. The biker frowned. "What?" Harry didn't answer. Outside, the sound grew louder, deep and mechanical, the kind of noise that spoke of weight and purpose. Sophie, standing by the counter, glanced toward the window. "What is that?" she whispered to Millie. But the biker was too busy trying to hold the room's attention. "Don't tell me you called the cops," he sneered at Harry. "Think they'll save you?" Harry's eyes met his. "Not exactly. Not exactly. 9 minutes since the call." The engines were close now, close enough that those near the windows could see the dark shapes moving down Main Street in tight formation. 4 Humvees, each one painted in standard-issue army green, rolled toward the diner with the kind of precision only the military could produce. The biker noticed the shift in the room first, the way people's eyes widened, the way they pressed toward the glass. He turned to look. His smirk faltered. Harry set his cup down carefully and adjusted his cap. "Showtime." The Humvees pulled to a stop outside, engines idling like the steady growl of a predator at rest. Doors swung open in near-perfect unison, and soldiers stepped out, uniforms crisp, movements sharp, their expressions leaving no doubt that they were here for a reason. At their head was Captain Daniel Whitaker, tall and broad-shouldered, his posture radiating command. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight for the diner door, the soldiers fanning out around the vehicles to control the perimeter. The biker's bravado shrank with every step Daniel took toward him. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. Harry leaned back in his booth, watching his son approach with the calm satisfaction of a man who knew exactly how the next few minutes would go. "This," he said evenly, "is what happens when you pick the wrong fight." Daniel stepped inside, his boots clicking against the tile. His eyes found his father immediately, noting the red mark on his cheek, the coffee stains on his sleeve. Then he turned to the biker, his voice flat but carrying across the diner. "You assaulted my father," he said. "That's not just an offense against an elderly man. That's an offense against a decorated combat veteran and against my family." The biker swallowed hard, suddenly looking smaller despite his size. The engines outside kept rumbling, a reminder that more soldiers waited just beyond the door. The tension in the diner coiled tight, ready to snap. And Harry, sitting with his coffee and steady gaze, knew the balance had shifted. The next move belonged to the biker, and it would determine just how hard the lesson was going to be. For a moment, the biker stood frozen in the middle of Millie's diner, his eyes flicking between the soldiers outside and Captain Daniel Whitaker standing just a few feet away. The easy swagger he'd worn like a second skin was gone, replaced by something closer to confusion and the first flicker of fear. "This is America," he finally said, his voice too loud, as though trying to reassert control. "You can't just roll up here with your toy army and try to intimidate me." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Sir, you assaulted a 79-year-old combat veteran in front of multiple witnesses. That's a felony. And you did it to my father. Your lucky local law enforcement will be handling this instead of the military police." The biker scoffed, forcing a laugh he didn't feel. "Oh, please. It was a slap. He's fine. Look at him." He gestured toward Harry, who sat calmly in his booth, hands wrapped around his coffee cup, as though none of this concerned him. Daniel took a single step closer, his voice dropping to something quieter but far more dangerous. "The difference between a slap and an assault is just semantics when you target a man like him. And the fact that you think it's acceptable to put your hands on an elderly person tells me everything I need to know about your character." The biker's jaw tightened. He looked around the diner, searching for some sign of support, but the remaining customers avoided his eyes. Even Millie, who had known Harry for over 60 years, stood with her arms crossed behind the counter, glaring at him like he was something she'd scrape off her shoe. "Look," the biker said, his voice hardening again. "I don't care who you are or what medals the old man's got. I'm not afraid of you." It was the wrong thing to say. Daniel's soldiers shifted subtly outside, their boots crunching on the pavement as they moved into more deliberate positions. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, disciplined, coordinated movement, the kind that made anyone with an ounce of sense take notice. Inside, the air grew thick with tension. Harry finally set his coffee down, his gaze steady on the man towering over him. "Son," he said, his tone calm, but carrying the weight of decades in uniform. "You've made enough mistakes for one day. Don't make another." The biker smirked at the word, "son," but the smirk didn't reach his eyes. "Or what? You gonna hit me back?" "No," Harry replied, "because I know better than to waste my time on someone who doesn't understand respect. But my son here," he nodded toward Daniel, "he might not be as patient." Daniel's expression didn't change, but his next words cut like glass. "Here's how this is going to go. You're going to sit down. You're going to wait for the sheriff to arrive. And you're going to leave this building in handcuffs without causing any more trouble. You've got 30 seconds to decide if you want to do that the easy way or the hard way." The biker hesitated, his pride wrestling with the growing reality that he was badly outmatched. In another life, with another audience, maybe he would have backed down. But something in him wouldn't let go of the need to prove himself. "You don't scare me," he growled, and then made the choice that sealed his fate. He stepped forward, squaring his shoulders, fists clenched. The movement was enough for the soldiers outside to react through the windows. The diner patrons saw them shift into defensive stances, hands near their holstered sidearms. Daniel didn't move, didn't flinch. "Don't," he said simply. The biker ignored him and kept coming. And then Harry was on his feet. It wasn't fast, not the explosive movement of a young man, but it was deliberate, steady, controlled. His height wasn't imposing, but his presence was. "I told you not to make another mistake," he said, stepping between the biker and his son. The room fell into silence so complete that even the faint rumble of the Humvee engines outside seemed muted. The biker stopped, uncertain now. Something in Harry's voice, its authority, its unshakable certainty, was more effective than any show of force. Daniel took advantage of the moment. That's it. Sit down. This time, the biker obeyed. Slowly, reluctantly, he slid into the nearest booth, his bravado leaking away like air from a punctured tire. He muttered something under his breath, but no one bothered to ask him to repeat it. Daniel kept his eyes on him as he spoke over his shoulder. Millie, call the sheriff. Tell him we have a citizen's arrest situation. Millie was already reaching for the phone. The biker tried one last tactic, attempting to play the victim. You're all overreacting. It's not like I hurt him. You're just making a big deal out of this because he's military. Harry shook his head. No, son. This is a big deal because you put your hands on another person without cause. That's wrong no matter who they are. The words hung in the air, simple and unarguable. The biker looked away. Outside, the soldiers didn't move from their positions. Their presence was enough silent, disciplined, unwavering. Inside, the tension began to shift. The immediate danger had passed, but the weight of what had just happened settled over the room like a heavy blanket. It wasn't just that the biker had picked a fight with the wrong man. It was that he'd picked a fight with someone who wasn't alone and never would be. Harry returned to his seat, lifting his coffee again, as if the last 10 minutes had been nothing more than an interruption to his morning ritual. Daniel remained standing, eyes on the biker until the sound of approaching sirens joined the low growl of the Humvees. The biker glanced toward the window, his face paling at the sight of the sheriff's cruiser pulling up beside the military vehicles. Daniel leaned down slightly, his voice quiet but firm. You're about to learn what consequences feel like. The biker didn't answer. When the sheriff stepped through the door, he took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, Harry standing tall beside his booth, Daniel between him and the biker, soldiers posted outside. His jaw tightened. Mr. Whitaker, I understand you had some trouble this morning. Harry gave a small nod. Nothing I couldn't handle. But my son thought it warranted some backup. The sheriff's eyes moved to the biker. Sir, stand up. The biker's hands twitched against the table.
It's ridiculous, he muttered.
It's assault, the sheriff replied evenly. On an elderly veteran. And we've got witnesses and cameras to prove it. Stand up. As the sheriff's deputy moved to take the biker into custody, Daniel stepped back, finally letting the tension in his shoulders ease. Harry sat again, sipping his coffee with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew that justice, real justice, was now in motion. The reversal was complete. The man who had walked into the diner trying to humiliate a veteran was leaving in the back of a police cruiser, his arrogance stripped away, and in the corner booth, Harry Whitaker resumed his morning coffee, the Humvees outside a silent reminder to the entire town. No one disrespects a soldier without answering for it. The sheriff's deputy moved in with quiet efficiency, securing the biker's wrists in handcuffs. The metal clicked shut with a finality that seemed to drain the last trace of defiance from him. A few minutes earlier, he'd been strutting through the diner like he owned it. Now, he was hunched slightly forward, his eyes darting around as though searching for a way out that didn't exist. Sheriff Cole Bradley, himself a Gulf War veteran, kept his expression unreadable as he read the man his rights. You are under arrest for assault on an elderly person, assault on a veteran, and disturbing the peace. You have the right to remain silent. His voice was steady, procedural, but there was a weight beneath it that only other veterans could detect, a quiet understanding that this wasn't just another call on a Tuesday morning. The biker tried to interrupt. Come on, Sheriff. This is crazy. It was just a slap. Everyone's blowing this way out of proportion because he's some decorated soldier. The sheriff's gaze hardened. No, we're here because you thought you could put your hands on someone without consequence. Whether he's a veteran or not, that's a crime. But in this case, you picked the wrong man in the wrong town. A murmur of agreement rippled through the few remaining patrons. Millie leaned against the counter, her arms crossed, watching with an expression halfway between relief and satisfaction. Sophie, the young waitress, let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Harry remained in his booth, one hand wrapped around his coffee cup, the other resting on the table. From the outside, he looked perfectly calm. But Daniel, standing just beside him, could read the subtle signs of tension the way his father's shoulders held a fraction tighter than usual. The slight set to his jaw. As the biker was escorted out, the rumble of the Humvee engines filled the diner again. The soldiers outside shifted their positions, maintaining a perimeter until the sheriff gave them a nod. Only then did they relax, their discipline never wavering. To the civilians watching, it was an impressive display of professionalism. To Harry, it was a reminder of the unspoken bond that linked every man and woman who had ever worn the uniform. Once the cruiser pulled away with the biker inside, the tension in the diner broke like a dam. Millie came over with the coffee pot, refilling Harry's cup without asking. "You all right?" she asked quietly. Harry gave a small smile. "Never better." Daniel allowed himself the faintest hint of a grin. "Told you we'd have your back, Dad." One of the soldiers outside, a young sergeant who couldn't have been more than 25, stepped in and approached Harry's booth. "Sir," he said, standing at attention. "It's an honor." Harry inclined his head. "The honor's mine, son. You keep doing what you're doing." The soldier gave a sharp nod before stepping back outside, leaving the father and son alone for a moment. "You didn't have to bring a convoy," Harry said, though there was no heat in his words. Daniel's expression softened. "Maybe not, but I wasn't about to let anyone lay a hand on you and think they could walk away from it. Besides, I wanted the whole town to see that we take care of our own." Harry's eyes shifted toward the window, where the Humvees still sat in formation. "They saw," he said simply. Over the next half hour, more townspeople began to filter in, drawn by the sight of military vehicles parked outside the diner. Some came just to shake Harry's hand. Others offered quiet words of support. A few admitted they'd seen the biker around before and had always gotten a bad feeling about him. By the time the soldiers prepared to depart, Main Street had become an impromptu gathering. Parents lifted their children to wave at the convoy, and the sound of hands clapping followed the Humvees as they rolled away. Sheriff Bradley stayed behind long enough to assure Harry that the biker would be facing serious charges. "With the witnesses we have and the security footage, there's not much he can argue. And given the assault was on a veteran, the DA will push for the maximum penalty." Harry nodded. "Good. Maybe he'll learn something from it." "Maybe," the sheriff said, "but I can guarantee the rest of the town learned something today." That evening, word of the incident spread beyond Millbrook. A photo snapped by a bystander Harry sitting in his booth with his coffee. Humvees lined up outside hit social media. Within hours it was being shared by veteran groups, military families, and local news outlets. The caption was simple: "Never mistake quiet dignity for weakness." Comments poured in from across the country. Strangers thanked Harry for his service. Others praised Daniel and his soldiers for their rapid response. And more than a few pointed out that the biker's arrogance had been dismantled in less than half an hour. By the following morning, Millie's diner had more customers than it had seen in years. Veterans from neighboring towns stopped by to shake Harry's hand or leave small tokens of appreciation, a challenge coin here, a patch there. Millie decided to set aside Harry's booth as the veterans' table, placing a small brass plaque on the wall behind it that read, "Reserved in honor of those who have served." The incident also sparked deeper conversations in the community. The town council convened an emergency meeting not just to commend Harry and Daniel, but to discuss ways to better support local veterans. Within a week, businesses up and down Main Street began displaying veteran-friendly signs in their windows. For Harry, The attention was both humbling and slightly uncomfortable. He hadn't sought recognition. His actions that morning had been guided by instinct and the values drilled into him decades earlier. But he understood the importance of what had happened. This wasn't just about him, it was about sending a message that veterans, and elders in general, deserved respect and protection. Daniel, for his part, received commendations from his commanding officer for his quick thinking and decisive action. Though some questioned the use of a military convoy for a civilian matter, the overwhelming sentiment was that it had been a textbook example of protecting one's own without crossing the line into unnecessary force. In quieter moments, father and son would sit together at the diner, sipping coffee and talking about the years between Harry's last deployment and Daniel's first. They both knew that their shared experience of service had shaped them, but this incident had forged something new. A public reminder of the bond that couldn't be broken by time, distance, or even peace. By the time the biker's court date arrived, the case had become something of a formality. Faced with overwhelming evidence, witness statements, high-definition security footage, and the unshakable testimony of 2 generations of soldiers, he pleaded guilty. The judge sentenced him to community service at the local VA hospital, hoping that working alongside wounded veterans might teach him something about humility and respect. Harry didn't attend the sentencing. For him, the matter had been settled the moment the sheriff's cruiser pulled away from the diner. But he did hear later from one of the VA staff that the biker kept his head down and did the work without complaint. Whether that meant genuine change or just quiet compliance, Harry didn't speculate. Some lessons take time to settle in. What mattered most to him was the way the town had rallied not just around him, but around the principles that had guided him all his life. Service above self, dignity in the face of aggression, and the unspoken promise that no one who has served will ever stand alone. In the weeks after the incident at Millie's diner, life in Millbrook found its rhythm again, but something had shifted. Conversations lingered a little longer at the veterans' table. Strangers nodded to Harry in the grocery store. Parents pointed him out to their children, telling them, "That's the man who taught this town what respect means." Harry himself tried to slip back into his usual quiet routine: morning coffee, small talk with the regulars, the slow walk past the war memorial. But the story had taken on a life of its own. Articles appeared in the local paper and neighboring county news, framing the event as a lesson in both discipline and unity. Veterans organizations began inviting Harry to speak at events, not to recount his service overseas, but to share the story of a Tuesday morning when he chose patience over retaliation. One afternoon, a boy of about 10 approached his booth, clutching a school project in both hands. It was a report on local heroes, and there, pasted between printed paragraphs, was a photo of Harry at his table, coffee cup in front of him, the Humvees visible through the window behind him. "Sir," the boy said shyly, "my dad says you didn't have to fight the bad guy to win." Harry smiled. "Your dad's right. Sometimes the smartest fight is the one you don't start." The boy grinned, saluted awkwardly, and hurried back to his parents. Daniel visited more often, their conversations deepening beyond the usual father and son talk. They began collaborating on a new community initiative, a mentorship program pairing young service members with older veterans. Harry wanted to make sure the wisdom of one generation flowed into the next, the way his mentors had guided him decades earlier. The biker, now serving his court-ordered community service at the VA hospital, faded from the headlines. Harry heard from acquaintances that the man kept his head down and did the work assigned to him. Whether it was penance or simply an avoidance of further trouble, Harry didn't dwell on it. The point had been made. In Millbrook, and far beyond, actions had consequences, especially when those actions targeted someone who had given so much in service. Millie's diner became a small pilgrimage site for veterans passing through. They came to see the brass plaque on the wall and, if they were lucky, to share a cup of coffee with the man himself. The conversations ranged from light-hearted stories to hard memories, but all were marked by mutual respect. On a quiet Saturday morning, as Harry sat in his booth watching the sun spill through the window, Daniel joined him, setting down 2 mugs of coffee. "You know, Dad," he said, "this whole thing, it's going to be remembered for a long time." Harry shrugged lightly. "If it makes people think twice before disrespecting an elder, or a veteran, or anyone who's earned their place in this world, then it's worth remembering." Daniel studied him for a moment. "It's more than that. You showed them strength. Doesn't have to be loud to be real." Harry looked out at Main Street, where the flags on the lampposts stirred in the morning breeze. "That's the thing about strength," he said quietly. "If it's real, you don't have to prove it to anyone, you just live it." And with that, he took another sip of coffee, the same way he had every morning for decades. Quiet, steady, and unshaken. The town's memory of that day would become part of its identity, a story passed down like a piece of local history. Not just about an old soldier and his son, but about a community reminded that respect, once given, has the power to change everything.